Light at the End of the World, which I had the privilege of reading in a draft form, and I was completely blown away by it. And I sent him many excited emails as I was reading it. And at the end, I wrote him saying that, it definitely seemed to me like a new kind of subcontinental novel had come into being with this book. And so we'll definitely speak about that as well, about the different formal choices Siddhartha's made, the ways in which his tireless work as a kind of reporter in India, a long-form reporter, has informed his fiction, the way the fiction bleeds back into the nonfiction, his work as a writer in the US, in India, in various other places, in the northeast of India, which is where he's from originally. Those are all subjects that'll come up. And before we start, I just wanted to read just Siddhartha's bio. Siddhartha, born in northeast India and the child of a refugee, is the author of the novels The Point of Return, a 2003 New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and An Outline of the Republic. He is also the author of the nonfiction book The Beautiful and the Damned, A Portrait of the New India. His reviews and journalism have appeared in the Boston Globe, The Guardian, Harper's Magazine, The Nation, New Statesman, N+1, and the Times Literary Supplement. So thank you so much for joining us today, Siddhartha. And Vazira and I will be in conversation with Siddhartha, but since this is a small group, I think everyone should feel free to jump in at any point. And as Vazira had suggested, I think it would be a nice idea to start with everyone just introducing themselves. So maybe, Vazira, we'll start with you, and then we can go full circle and come back to me.
I'm Vazira Zamindar. I'm in the history department.
I'm Riya. I'm also in the history department. I'm a grad student. I don't remember if you met. We met at a Dissent rooftop celebration.
One of the balcony parties.
Yes, the balcony party.
She's also a rock star, so being very modest.
She is a rock star.
Literally, yeah.
Rock star who happens to be in the
a grad student.
in the history
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Arman. I'm an undergrad studying computer science and history.
amongst other things.
I'm Shafali, and I'm a first year in fiction and literary arts.
I'm Ed. I was working at faculty clubs here at Brown, but I also work for something called the Howard Foundation, which was able to support Siddartha's work a few years ago. We're going to be here to support it further.
Yeah, I'm Bill Pham, alumni at Brown, and went to medical school, graduated in 1982. Eventually become a heart surgeon, retired, and very interesting to learn more about humanity, particularly interesting in the Indian culture.
Hi, I'm Sued. I'm a visiting faculty in the history department.
And I'm Karan Mahajan. I'm an associate professor in literary arts at Brown. All right, well, without further ado, let's start, Siddhartha. So do you think we can have you read just for a few minutes from the book first, to give people a taste of
Sure.
the madness we're going to be immersed in as we
Sure.
discuss the book?
The first sighting of that astonishing, amazing, misunderstood creature that came to be known as the New Delhi Monkey Man occurred sometime in the month of May, at the beginning of the new century. The name, in the way these things often tend to be in India, was a misnomer, for in spite of the use of New Delhi to describe it, New Delhi Monkey Man made his presence felt mostly across the dying Yamuna River, in that trans-Yamuna zone of housing society, apartment blocks, slums, and factories that New Delhi likes to pretend doesn't exist. Yet the name caught on in trans-Yamuna Delhi, in New Delhi, in the world at large, in Brooklyn, New York, cultural appropriation capital of the universe. A music band gave itself the name New Delhi Monkey Man. It's impossible that trans-Yamuna Monkey Man or Noida Monkey Man, or Uttar Pradesh Monkey Man would have worked quite so well. But what was New Delhi Monkey Man? Was he a monkey? Was he a man? Was he even a he? The Delhi police, that selfless organization whose reassuring slogan at the time read, "For you, with you, always," at first said that New Delhi Monkey Man was nothing more than a man in a monkey mask going around frightening people. Concerned citizens were asked to call a special hotline if they saw New Delhi Monkey Man and wait for a van to be dispatched. Until said concerned citizens spotted said dispatched police van, easily identifiable by the large slogan on its side, "For you, with you, always," they were asked to remain indoors and not attempt to apprehend New Delhi Monkey Man on their own. Still, what if New Delhi Monkey Man was not just a gangster with a monkey mask or a rowdy cheater in a monkey costume? What if his tail was not made out of stuffed cloth like a Rajasthani puppet? Yes, what if New Delhi Monkey Man was Hanuman himself come to wreak havoc on a fallen, debased people who had deviated from the true faith of their forefathers? When Mrs. Chawla, on observing New Delhi Monkey Man grinning at her with yellow third-world teeth from among the clothes strung out to dry in her balcony, recited loudly from the Hanuman Chalisa, "Jai Jai Guru Hanuman," did New Delhi Monkey Man smile and bless her, or did he become enraged and attack her? Neighbors of different political persuasions provided different endings to Mrs. Chawla's story. And so, what if New Delhi Monkey Man was not Hanuman at all, but a kind of anti-Hanuman? What if he was a liberated Hanuman, a monkey tired of being a servant and operating as a prison for humans posing as gods, with a heart-shaped cell in his body that contained small versions of Ram and Sita, a monkey who no longer wanted to serve as an assassin in a genocidal war? What if New Delhi Monkey Man was a clone of some kind, a man-monkey hybrid, escaped from a top-secret joint venture facility run by the Defense Research and Development Organization and the Ombani Labs in some remote border area? What if New Delhi Monkey Man was a mutant creature produced by the toxic gas cloud of Bhopal in 1984? What if New Delhi Monkey Man was an extraterrestrial creature, an alien accidentally marooned on this planet? What if New Delhi Monkey Man was a strange new mutation, an outcome of artificial intelligence stirring into consciousness in the aftermath of Y2K? What if New Delhi Monkey Man had time traveled from the past, coming at us from the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857 or from the killing fields of partition in 1947? What if, while traveling through time, New Delhi Monkey Man came to the new millennium, not from the past, but from our future?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I wanted to actually start with a question about genre, because that's something that's very evident even in the section that you read, where one, I think people haven't mentioned enough in the reviews of the book how funny the book can be, despite it being very bleak. But the book does this thing where it takes often some kind of historical artifact or event that is real or a little bit uncanny. In the case of New Delhi Monkey Man, which was a real phenomenon in Delhi in the 90s, of people thinking they'd seen this creature, and then spins it off wildly into different directions, right? So I was wondering, when you started conceiving the book, were you aware that you were going to make these sort of cross-genre leaps, or that's something that emerged as you were writing?
Yeah, I think I knew that I wanted to do the cross-genre across the book, play with different genres. I didn't necessarily know what genres they would be when I first started. That emerged in the working of the book. But I think I knew that I was moving away from realist fiction, which is something that I had worked in myself in that vein in the previous novels. They were very, very attached to realism, to a kind of social realism. And I began to, I think, because I work in nonfiction and as a journalist, when I'm very bound to the facts, but I also come across things that cannot be verified factually, that are strange, that are odd, that are weird. I keep using this word weird, it's a useful word for the book. But so I knew I wanted to move away from realism because both for literary reasons and for social reasons, because in a way, I find it very hard to understand the world I'm living in, whether that is Modi's India or even the United States. I find it very hard to understand it through the framework that I grew up with of history, realism, democracy, liberalism, even social justice. I find it very hard to, for instance, I don't understand, like there's a genocide happening in full daylight, and it is happening all the time, and things are still normal at a certain level, or, at the level of institutions, almost, and these are institutions that one works with, universities, newspapers, magazines. So I think India did that earlier. We already saw that. So in that sense, I had been prepared very well, but it hasn't helped. You think it would help? It hasn't. But I knew I was moving away. I wanted to move away from realism, partly because the strangeness of reality was something that couldn't, for me, be adequately grasped. And that includes both the past and the present and the bits of the future that we see, because it's not these things are discrete and neatly contained. There are bits of the past that are present here, and there are bits of the future that are present here. So I was moving away. I knew I wanted to move away from realism, that strict realism couldn't really contain it. And I knew I was interested in historical moments like the partition and the Sepoy Rebellion. But there are great partition narratives already. There are amazing partition narratives in more than one language. But they largely work within the vein of realism, and that is understandable. Manto is a bit of an exception to that, but he's working with the absurd as well. But generally, partition, it's a big historical, it's genocide. It's like it's the end of something, the beginning of something. But I knew I didn't want to do that directly because I felt it had been done very well before. And so that's where genre and the weird and the other elements came in. And they came in the same way in like Union Carbide, which is a very much a realist story in a certain way. But again, if you are reporting it, it always contained these elements of the uncanny or the strange or the weird. And so the novel's way to experiment with genre was to really try and attempt to capture that. And the other thing is that genre is for me, it's very pleasurable as a reader. As a reader, it's something that a lot of very serious thinking and writing happens in genre fiction. And I sometimes think South Asians are, particularly in India, the Indian elites are quite resistant to genre because they think it's children's writing, or it's like not quite serious. It's not, there's always a suspicion about fiction to begin with, and then science fiction, fantasy, and you can see where it comes from, and yet, to me it was very appealing, and I wanted to read a book about India that captured the weirdness, and I felt it didn't exist, so I kind of sat around trying to write it, and genre was very much a part of it, yeah.
I should just add, for the benefit of you who have not read the book, that the book is also formally very inventive in its structure, which is that it begins in sort of a slightly alternative Delhi. But really, it seems maybe 5 years ago it would have been called futuristic, but it just actually seems like present day polluted Delhi. And then it moves backwards in time through a series of fairly discrete narratives, but that are linked by this kind of sense of uncanniness and weirdness. So you have a narrative that happens in 1984, before the Bhopal gas tragedy. Then you have one that happens in 1947, just days before India's independence. In Calcutta.
1947.
Yeah. And then you have one that happens in 1859, a couple of years after the Sepoy Mutiny, and which involves automatons coming to life, among other things. So the follow-up question I had, which I know Vazira also had a question related to, is you're also someone who did a PhD in literature. You're sort of very aware of the history of the South Asian novel, and to me, it's interesting that there was a period where the South Asian novel was dominated by Rushdie kind of magic realism. Then it went through a period of a lot of realism. And now someone like you has come out the other end with a different amalgam. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how you feel your form of weirdness or uncanniness differs from magic realism, which was another kind of attempt to move beyond plain realism.
Yeah, we were talking about the connection with Rushdie, which kind of surprised me when I was reading it. I didn't have the drafts to sift through and think with. And I didn't expect that connection in the novel at all, but yet it seemed to be, rather than particularly shame and satanic verses and dreams and the play with the absurd, the idea of the absurd, and the very important kind of narrative work that it does in in both dreams and absurdities that your novel suffuses time with. Yeah.
So I kind of read in a very. I read. I'm always happy with my reading. I've told this is like in an interview, and I'm not always happy with my writing, but I'm always happy with my reading. Like, sometimes my friends or sometimes even my students will ask what you were reading, and I will be reading something totally different from what I was reading last week. Like, right now I'm reading Muriel Spark, whose life from the second half of the 20th century, British woman writer. I think last week I was reading this Chilean writer, Nona Fernandez, So I'm always happy with my reading. And so Rushdie is complicated for me, because obviously Midnight's Children is the first book of his that I read. And I read Midnight's Children as a teenager, and that in the periphery of India, and I felt, oh wow, this is the first novel I'm reading, which is actually about people like us, because, and because until then, all the books that one was reading in English, they were either by British writers or by American writers. They had no, if they had South Asian characters, they were, in like the Raj Quartet kind of thing. But Rushdie, Midnight's Children, I mean, Bombay was a whole world apart. I'd never seen Bombay, but it didn't seem to matter. It was still, and then shame, again, seemed to be about us. So, and then, I read Midnight's Children again in graduate school after in 20, 30 years later, and I thought it's still a very, very good book. I thought it's still a very impressive book. But I don't know. I mean, I'm sure Midnight's Children was in my head as a kind of, because it's such a huge defining book for a subcontinent, basically. But I think the influences are really more wide. Some of it comes from, I think when I started reading the Chilean writer Roberto Bolaño, I think Bolaño was a kind of was a liberation for me. And he had already died when he became very famous, which was sad, but it was good in a certain way, but Bolaño was just like, I started reading Bolaño and I realized he wasn't writing in the dominant Anglo-American realist mode, but he wasn't doing magic realism in the Garcia Marquez way either. He was doing something new with combining, he was still writing very critically about the world, but there's more media, for instance, in Bolaño. There's more television, there's more B-movies, there's more, and maybe that comes into the things like the New Delhi Monkey Man, urban legends, right? So there are entire new realities since in the last 20, 30 years of neoliberalism, the end of the left, the end of the third world. I mean, this book is also, there's a kind of mourning which is very, very hidden. It's only for a few people, but there's a kind of mourning for a kind of dream of the third world, of the decolonization, which is gone. That's the wreckage that BB is walking in. That is gone, and we don't know what is to come. So Bolaño, and then I have to say, actually, there's a local influence, which I only realized a long way through the novel. I actually realized that the dreams, and that is H.P. Lovecraft. And this book, I was writing it for a long time, and then I said, wow, it is actually in conversation with Lovecraft, but it has exactly the opposite view. So for Lovecraft, the unknown is the source of great terror, and for me, the unknown is actually the source of possible liberation. So it kind of flips that, but I think again, like I think Sandeep Roy in Calcutta, when he was doing the event with me, he said, your characters dream of each other, and I said, yes, that is true. And that's not a very realist connection, because how could they? They exist in different times, they exist in different places. They can't rationally, realistically know each other. But again, I find the dreams and the unconscious are very, very important in this book. So, so there's a kind of,
In Shame, there's this line, failure of the dreaming mind. And in a way, you are kind of repopulating dreams or making dreams do a certain kind of work that suffuses the book with both, it is gritty, but there is always this sense of possibility at the precipice of disasters unfolding, and so I was struck by the kind of restoration or restitution of dreaming that is part of the novel.
Yeah, I think it's one of the last liberated spaces we have, and even there, not entirely, but I mean that's where the unconscious, in a classic sort of Freudian way, reveals itself. But dreams also have a very strong place in human culture, pre-Freudian. I mean, it is there in. Dreams are, meant to foretell. They're symbolic. They have meaning. They have meaning that can't be reduced always to the everyday. So, it's something that and in the present, it's like I think Jonathan Crary in his book 24/7, he talks about how sleep is the last realm where you cannot actually buy something. It's the only space that has been left by capitalism, because now you can buy something even when you're sitting on the toilet, which you couldn't say 20 years ago, but now you could be sitting in the toilet seat, and you could be on your phone and you could order something. And your sleep is just the last space where there can be no buying and selling. And in that sense, it is an unproductive space for capitalism, because it can't, it's, if you don't buy and sell. So and within sleep, the dream is like it's another deeper dive. So I find that kind of stuff fascinating.
Should I jump into the time question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So as you already heard, that the novel has these chapters which are like 1984, 1947, and 1859, so it's sort of going backwards. And so actually it was interesting because I was finishing and thinking about your novel, finishing reading your novel and thinking about it, and my son called me and he said, "Oh, what does Foucault's History of the Present mean for you?" and so that got me thinking, because it had been a while since I'd had to actually grapple with Foucault. So here's my Foucault question for you. I'm going to read some little bits from Foucault to think with this, because on the base level, you see, the novel is going backwards in time in some ways. And in going backwards or looking backwards, there are, of course, the elegiac, nostalgic, exilic sensibilities. And in a way, the novel refuses those sensibilities. So in that thinking with history of the present, I thought there's two ideas in Foucault: diagnosis and conditions of possibility.
So what's the first one? Sorry.
Diagnosis and conditions of possibility. So there's this self-conscious, explicit diagnosis of the problem of the present, from which you try to work out a genealogy. But this genealogy is not a search for origins. It's not finding a solution or an origin for it, but rather, and this is a quote from Foucault's Nietzsche genealogy in history, the search for descent is not the erecting of foundations. On the contrary, it disturbs what was previously thought immobile. It fragments what was thought unified. It shows the heterogeneity of what was imagined consistent with itself, with the idea that instead to trace the erratic, the discontinuous process whereby the past becomes the present, or often the aleatory or fractured descent, in which emergence and this conception of emergence where the present is contingent. The present is contingent, and therefore there's an openness to the future, and there is an address to the future that is integral to thinking this way with the past. And so in some ways, also the passage that you read of the Monkey Man, where the what if is a recurring sort of trope, and ends with an address to the future rather than the present. That if that might be a way to think with. So here the question, is there a diagnosis of the present that shaped or made you go to or think with? And if one might invite you to think about the conditions of possibility that you in each of these moments are opening up. Maybe that's too much of a historian's question, or maybe it's too much of a historian's reading to think of, in what may be best left to the novelist's craft of doing a certain kind of fragmenting. And I ask it also because I thought, every history class starts with the past and we move our way forward. What if I was to completely revamp my Making of Modern South Asia class and taking your novel as cue, begin with the present with then episodes of the past? How would that look like? And therefore, I wanted to make you think aloud about both a diagnosis and with emergence and possibility in this mode of moving backwards while refusing the nostalgic.
I mean, it's a great question, and I love the Foucault quote. I'm going to have to take it down from you later. I haven't read Foucault since graduate school, but obviously I did read Foucault with great interest in graduate school, and and all these things though. When you're writing fiction, they go inside. They go into they go unconscious, but I mean, I'll start with a slightly angular way, so just bring Foucault in. So the last part of the novel takes place in the Andaman Islands, and it's a big question whether it is, technically it's part of Indian territory, but whether it should be, and I'm always asking these questions. In this novel, but also every novel, I'm always asking this question, should India be India? And in that sense, I'm really That's been true from the first novel onwards. Like, what does it mean? What does it mean? And I think it's a really, it's not a question that I ask out of choice. It's partly out of personal history. Maybe that's where the attachment to the backward movement goes. That was, again, true a little bit in the Point of Return too, in a certain part. But when I I knew this novel was going to end in a part of India where India is really called into question, physically, geographically. And so at a certain point, it became very clear that it had to be the Andaman Islands. And it fit in with all the other elements of the narrative that had already, the other narratives, all the things that were showing up. And so at a certain point, being a journalist and having I went through the Andaman Islands to, let's put in a little bit of research, and actually try to get some details on what it looks like, because what a place looks like on photos and Google is nothing like, not when you get there. But, of course, one of the things, when I went there, of course, one of the things I wanted to go to was that the Andaman Islands was obviously first colonized by the British, and it was colonized as a penal colony for Indian prisoners from the 1857 rebellion initially. So, but the fascinating thing is that it is a panopticon prison. And unfortunately, because of the earthquake, it's been damaged. So it's only a few wings of the panopticon are left. But originally, it was very much built along, the idea of the panopticon and a kind of a rational surveillance and policing. So, Foucault Foucault's spirit was there in that sense, But going back to the novel, I mean, how it talks about what if? What if is always a question I'm haunted by, both at a kind of a personal level, but also at a larger collective social level, because I don't think things have to be this way. What if, something, that's one way. But essentially when you're writing a novel like this, I mean, when I was doing it, I don't think I had quite the sense of, I knew it was crazy, but I said it's interesting to me. Can you do all these things? Can you put in all these things? Can you connect this with that and have a novel? Which is I still wanted it to be a readable, I wanted it to be a readable novel. I want people to take pleasure from the storytelling. I don't want it to be just completely avant-garde, where, I didn't want it to be like Finnegan's Wake or, like the, Woolf's last novel, which you kind of want to read because, these are great writers, but, they are not easy. No, I didn't want that. I wanted there to be some kind of pleasure in the narrative, in the storytelling. And I think that's what genre does. Genre allowed me to bring in that in. So something like, The Monkey Man, or there are certain tropes like following, which certain aspects of noir which come in, which balance the complicated ideas. But yeah, there is a kind of, mourning, there is a kind of looking back, there is a kind of, I thought a lot about the structure, what the structure should be. And of course the easy thing would have been to make them 4 novellas, starting from the oldest one first to the, and make it a straight march of time. But that would have been very dissatisfying to me as a reader. It was much more fascinating for me to begin with BB in this slightly near future and then go backwards and then sort of come back again. But I think that's partly has to do with formal pleasures as well, the pleasures of narrative. Like, I think a lot about how to move the reader. And I've been, so for me those things are very important as well. Where to stop telling you the story and to change the story. I'm very interested in those things as well. So they come together along with the ideas, if that makes any sense. Because I'm writing like, you're writing the story, you're writing the novel, and you're kind of writing from within. And it's the ideas are there, but it's being unpacked it's being followed, it's being pursued through the narrative. and sometimes the narrative will open a door and say, okay, this is the moment where you show this. It's very interested in prisons, for instance. It's very interested in buildings. It's very interested in a certain kind of architecture, for instance. I don't really have an explanation for that. It's very interested in museums.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
museums are like, are they like your Foucault's prisons? Or asylum, actually. I was thinking Foucault's asylum does a certain kind of, potentiality work, and the museum is like both prison and...
And Foucault, I think, does show up there because, it's very interested in hospitals and prisons and asylum, and, it's a certain kind of municipal 19th century buildings and a kind of certain kind of rationality of the state. So I suppose that's where Foucault comes in. Comes in there. It's all permeated.
Yeah, I had a sort of related question, which is that and maybe you could take us into the process of conceiving the book, which is that your work seems to me to be really galvanized by, and I think this was said in a review too, by a kind of political outrage, right? Like, Beautiful and the Damned, which if you haven't read, I would highly recommend. I thought it was maybe the best book about New India. It was a nonfiction book where Siddhartha traveled through different parts of India, different classes, sort of just taking the temperature of what is going on with the kind of liberalized capitalist India and who the winners and losers are. And this book seems to have, if I were to say there's a connecting thread, right? There's a kind of dismay at what is going on politically with the kind of fascistic takeover of institutions in India, right? So let's say you're Siddhartha Deb and you're sitting down, you're angry about this, and you're like, I want to write a novel, right? I want you to walk us through this, right? Like, why does it take this particular form? Like, why do you start with a character? So the main character who holds it together is Bibi, who's she's from Shillong, right? Like you, she's from Shillong. She's an ex-journalist who's kind of starts getting trapped in these different layers of conspiracy. And then, of course, we've talked about this, and Vazira brought it up nicely, like the different sections that you move through to the past. Why did it take that form? Why not, there's a lot of novels that are being written in response to Modi's India that have a very different, someone's writing about a Modi-like character. There's no Modi in this novel, for example, right? So, talk about that.
Yeah, that would have been dull to put,
right. No, it would be,
for me, that would have been dull.
Add something to the question.
Yeah.
I did not read the book, but I read your interview in The Nation, in which you talked about how you were not just critiquing the conception of the country, majoritarian conception, but also the liberal idea. And
right.
Perry Anderson. So I thought if you could also...
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, that was Feroz Rathar, actually, and the interview. Yeah, I mean, I said that, in the interview I said that I had kind of moved away from realism a little bit because of all the difficulties I had with liberalism and its idea of this triumphal view of history, which, you can see being brutally challenged, like right now, again and again. But obviously, we should be able to see this even without Palestine, because there is, as many of you know, there is a lot of brutality and suffering in the world, and it doesn't fit in with this triumphant paradigm. But to go back to Karan's question, why write it like this? I really like that as a question. Because, there are people who are writing about the present dispensation. I think I didn't want to write just about the present, though. I wanted to write about, again, the present and the past and the future mixed together. So I didn't want to write just about Modi or Hindutva, because the things that I was interested in goes beyond. So, and I think they are connected. So, for instance, the what if. It's always struck me as fascinating that, having been a journalist, that the Union Carbide disaster is essentially forgotten both in India and in the United States. And which is why I always say there will never be an HBO show called Bhopal, you know. No, there will not be.
There's a Netflix show.
There's a Netflix show which one of my American the American historian Jeff Kingston has told me is very bad. He said you can save yourself the trouble of watching it, but it's not just Union Carbide. It's also the Bengal famine, right? I mean, so I think Modi is the people that Modi depends on, which are basically most of my family. To them, these things are absurdities. Why would you even be caught up with discussing these things? But they can be hung up on the idea that beef eating came to the subcontinent with Muslims in the 12th century, which is patently untrue, right? So there is, on the one hand, a refusal to really understand the multiple things we are and the various places we come from. And there is also then this concocted past, present, future line. And I think there are two versions of it. One is the sort of the fascist version, which depends on, which you see with Modi, and you see in this country with Trump. And that's easy to critique, actually. But then there's the neoliberal, there's the liberal version, which, so, you know, I've been a critique of the New India before Modi, you know, even when the Congress was in power. And that's why my character in 1984, when he shows up, I mean, I know when he showed up in my head that he literally shows up and he's in the train, and I know he has just participated in the killing of Sikhs in Delhi under a Congress government and is now going to Bhopal. And so I am interested in these continuities as well as ruptures. But yeah, I mean, for me, I didn't want to write directly about Modi or the India Hindu right, because that's what I do in my journalism. That's my journalism is very direct. I will go there, I will talk to people, I will hang out, I will interview them. It's very, very straightforward in that sense. This one, it's a novel. Ultimately, at the end of the day, there has to be more space for play. There has to be more, even though it's such a dark subject, there has to be more space for imagination. And it was more interesting to think in this novel what this is about, and not just the surface manifestation, which is what ultimately I think Modi is, a kind of surface manifestation. Well, what is it deeper down? What is this about? And then we get into these really complicated but interesting questions about, you know, the past, the third world, climate collapse, disaster, and then increasingly, you know, questions about, I think one of the best reviews, one of the best pieces on the book is by Amit Baisha, who's really read my book really wonderfully, actually. And he's done it through the work of Mark Fisher. And I know Mark Fisher's work very little in passing. I used to read some of the blogs, but I've not read the book, The Weird and the Eerie. But he does that, and as a lens to look at this book, and I think he does a very, very convincing. You know, he's the critics. I'm just the writer. So, but you know, so for me, it was more interesting to explore these uncanny or weird elements, because I think I think ultimately, you know, there's a part of me that's a journalist, which is very straightforward, very factual, and very much attached to, you know, I will go there, I will ask you these questions. But another part of it is that, wow, you know, in the 2014 elections, Modi, you know, there were holograms of him being projected to the villages. And people just take it for granted that this is a normal use of technology, because there's this huge techno-triumphalism, right, in India, in this country especially. And I want to sit and sometimes say, but this is very weird. In just what I said, you know, you can actually you can shop while you're sitting in the toilet. This is also very strange. This is not something that humanity has necessarily done for most of their life. When I teach in my creative writing classes, I tell students that most people throughout history have not really had a good idea of what their own faces looked like until the last 30 years. Because you didn't have great mirrors everywhere. You went to the studio, you and this is even after the coming of the camera, most people didn't have this visual idea, and now we are constantly, you can see constantly in the train, people are like, doing these angles of themselves. We know all these uncanny spaces of our faces, right? But this is absolutely new to humanity. And so I think the novelist in me, the fiction writer in me, that's why this is a novel and it's not a polemical tract or not a nonfiction. It's a space to think about, this is so strange. Like demonetization. People had, people don't know necessarily what demonetization is, but essentially what happened was, maybe it was 7 years ago, the Indian government just by fiat decided to cancel certain notes, denomination notes. And there was a date, and you had to turn these notes into the bank, otherwise they would all be gone. They would become valueless. How does a government decide suddenly in a country where billions, millions of people depend on a cash economy, this is, and there were these scenes that were incredible of people at queues, people fighting, and of course the rich were not affected by it, but the poor people, they've said, and the whole thing was we're going to catch the people who are, stocking illegal money. But that's all in Swiss banks and in Mauritius, that's not in the little bags of cash. That's the petty profiteers. But I just thought it was so strange. So there were a lot of social critics, and see, most of my friends belong to that group, and I'm fine with that rational social critic, but I also have to think about how strange it is that one party, one man can just wake up one day and decide that we're just going to cancel, that all your $20 notes are no longer going to be valid unless you turn them in within the next 30 days. And then millions of people, and of course, people queuing up, it was reminiscent of the way people queue up to vote, except he had reversed it, right? Instead of it being about rights, instead of about being, representing yourself democratically, you were being called by fiat. And of course, that is a great part of the hard, humiliating experience of being a poor person in the global South, that much of your life is given to a kind of humiliation to extract even the most basic things out of the government. And that is there from my life, that is there from my reporting, but that's part of the rage. It's not just about what is happening in the world. It's also the fact that, there is just absolutely no sense of people actually having rights. That is the truth for the vast majority of people. But yeah, I think in the novel, in the novel it was more interesting to take elements of what exists and twist it further. And so it's not just one wave of demonetization, but there have been serial waves of demonetization. And yes, they have not just done the moon landing, but they've actually sent in a piloted mission to Mars. That's how this is the near future, and it's piloted by a monkey. That's very important. This is the near future where it just basically, the right just keeps winning the elections, the pollution keeps getting worse, and they have sent a monkey to Mars, and which might have seen something that the government doesn't want to talk about. So that's where, I don't know, I have fun. I mean, you have to have fun.
Yeah.
Otherwise you just get depressed.
I mean, it's pushing the absurdity in a way that can open up a different way of seeing altogether. Want to see the other questions or?
I have some, and then whenever anyone wants to dive in anytime, feel free to just put your hand up or to, hi.
Yeah, thanks. I haven't read the book. I'm sorry, there were too many deadlines. I wanted to read it before I came to the talk. But just picking up this idea of time, as a narrative, what does going backward in time give you what did it give you that you didn't think you would get by going forward? And the second related question is, how do you write something like that? I think the only other novel that I've read which goes backwards is one by Sarah Waters. I don't remember the name of the novel, but it's set in the Second World War. But in any case, how do you write something like that?
And to throw in another comparison, because Palestine has come up, my initial response to your novel was Time of White Horses, which goes back.
That's the Turkish novel?
No, that's the Palestinian Time of White Horses.
Oh, what's the name of the writer?
It's Ibrahim Nasrallah about a Palestinian family, but it goes back in time. But one of the differences in that going back is that this looking backwards is has this kind of elegiac quality, as in giving an account of continuous loss, and in a way, both loss and waiting are like a structure that's looking backwards. One could say a certain, elegiac way of looking backwards also is laden with loss. But in your novel, you're looking back and it's deeply populated within any of those moments possibility. Anything else could have happened. The plane could have taken off. There's a ancient plane being built called Vimana. I mean, there's a lot of things happening in each, which could have turned into something else.
Right.
At the, almost.
Yeah,
to,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the simplest, the biggest thing is influence would obviously be the whole, Benjamin's Angel of History, right? Flying backwards, basically, and just looking at the rubble of the past, the wreckage of the past piling up as it flies backwards. But you're right that this isn't, here the looking backwards isn't just about wreckage and isn't just about, being elegiac, but, there's a kind of possibility as well. You're looking back at the past, and the past is terrible, but there are these doors in the past, there are these other doors which could have been opened to the side. And I think I find, I think looking back, in part it allows me to look at these, again, the title of the novel, it looks at these moments which are like world-ending moments for these characters in certain ways. Apocalyptic sort of moments, right? What else could it be? I mean, if you wake up in the old Bhopal and there is a gas that is choking everybody, and then there's just bodies just piling up around you, that is a world-ending moment. Why isn't, so there is that, the looking back, so the structure allows you to do that. But I think it keeps the reader, I hope it keeps the reader interested. I don't want the reader to think, oh, this is like a march through history book. We are going to go from the 19th to 20th to this and that, because it's very easy to say, okay, there are echoes of the past in the present. But there are also echoes of the present in the past, and I am also fascinated by that in this novel. So that's part of it. But in terms of the writing, each novella was conceived separately initially. The question of where to fit in what came later, the question of structure. I knew, I think at a certain point, that the frame was going to be sort of BB's narrative, which is set in the most identifiably the present, near future. I knew I wanted to be that the frame for various reasons, including, her as a character. And then, it was a question of the inset novellas. Should they go backwards or should they go forwards? And I thought they just worked better. I thought there's a different impact, like from going from BB to the 1984 section, which is done from the perspective of this sort of assassin of the Hindu right and very sort of toxic, sort of masculine, violent sort of figure. And I thought there was a certain shock value, which I wanted. Sometimes, I am interested in these things. Like, I don't want the reader to get comfortable entirely. I want them to like, now you're suddenly in a completely different mindset. I think it's better done that way than it would have been the other way around. So that's one aspect of it. That's one of the things. And the same thing, I thought that followed by the 1947 section allowed for a slight change of tone, because Das is a slightly more hapless character, a more likable character than the previous one who precedes him. And then the 19th century section was, of course, I was doing this sort of colonial, but I was also playing with genre. So I was doing a Western, but I was doing a Eastern, because it's set in the mountains of Himalayas, but it's basically white men on horses and guns, going after a fugitive. But I said, why can't I do an Eastern, and I did an Eastern. So that was, and that one became, I was not expecting the comedy in that, but somehow when I got them together, these characters, and they started talking to each other, funny. They just became, they were colonialists, but they were also very funny. And so I thought that the tone was good. And then, because I wanted switches in tone and mood and taste as well, because it's a big novel. So that's one of the things. And then eventually, once I grow out the structure, of course, there's the question of the echoes. What's going to echo where? Who's going to dream of whom where? Some of it was already happening, but then the connections began to be drawn out, and there are connections. There was a way to make it even more obvious, but my editor and I decided not to make it obvious. There is a kind of but I think a lot of people say, how are these characters related? They are not from the same family. And I just thought that right now I find this boring, the idea that everybody has to be from the same family. Right. I don't want them to be from the same family. I want them to be completely different kind of people. But they are connected to each other. And, they sometimes dream of each other. And they're not even the same. Mm-hmm. They don't even have the same sensibility or ethics sometimes. But I just found that more interesting. Nobody seemed to have done it in South Asian fiction in English. It's not that uncommon in other languages. But in English, it's nobody, at least to my knowledge, had not done it. And I thought, why not have fun with this? Why not try and do it? So that's what I got into going backwards.
I had another question about the kind of techniques that you've used to change the kind of fabric of the realist novel. I just want to read a paragraph from the novel, which I liked a lot. This is being written by a blogger in the novel. Sometimes it seems as if India now is like the United States of a 1990s television series called The X-Files, with aliens and experiments and conspiracies of the deep state. Yet we are not quite the American national security state that white supremacy determined to burn its toxic imprint upon the universe. If they are Rome to Britain's Greece, a mimic empire filled with a frenzy to outdo the original, we are a mimic of the mimic, a copy of a copy. Think of your dropped calls and ask yourself, is Ambani really capable of building a super weapon when it can't even run a mobile network? This is an original part of the novel, which is that it co-opts and uses conspiracy theories as part of its storytelling technique, right? Even the Monkey Man is a kind of conspiracy theory run amok. Uh-huh. What were the kind of creative challenges of writing in that way, of building conspiracies into the structure of the novel?
I mean, it's kind of fun actually, because you can't do it in journalism, and because
I would argue a lot of journalism is conspiracy theories, but yes, I understand what you mean.
Yeah, so, but I mean, partly I was also because again I was interested in incorporating voices, but The X-Files is a nod. It's actually a show that I like a lot, and it's a very interesting show because it. And in fact, Ari Bostov has a very nice collection of essays on the X-Files. They're a writer for, I think N+1 published the collection, and I read some of the essays. And it's very, very good because it's just, on the surface, it's a popular entertainment channel, but it manages to go deep into questions about the state and, the questions of the uncanny, the questions of, identity. So, it's a bit of a nod, and it's certainly something of an influence. But, I mean, like, for instance, like when I was in Bhopal on the 30th anniversary, there were two kinds of conspiracy theories. One was from the elite, which was that the poor people, they just make a big deal out of it. And why do you journalists have to come and still write about this? The journalists, they don't say that, by the way. The journalists I know in Bhopal are very, very good. They're not. They never say that but people are like, the poor just make a big deal out of it, and now they're getting free medical care. This is the elite theory of and you have a version of this everywhere, every country, right? Here, the welfare queens and so on. And then there was the conspiracy theory of the poor, which I found vastly more interesting, which was that this was not, they say this wasn't an accident. They said it was an experiment. It was a deliberate experiment done on us. And this had to do with the United States. And look, they went to war in Iraq after that, didn't they? And of course, it makes no sense at all, rationally. But it's a novel. And that's why a novel can deal with questions of the irrational. And I thought, okay, what if it was an experiment? And there are some questions. I had some ethical questions, like is it ethical to write about something that actually happened? So I actually talked to my friend Abdul Jabbar, who died some years ago. But he's a friend of mine, and he was the main. I've written about him in The Beautiful and the Damned. He's the main organizer against the Union Carbide for 30 years. And then we talked about it, and I said, I've written about it in nonfiction, and nobody cares. Nobody cares. So why not? I think I have the right to now tackle it in fiction. So it's that what if question again, so the whole, to take your questions together. It's not challenging. It's fun actually, because the New Delhi Monkey Man. So most of the New Delhi Monkey Man, apart from the riffs about the future, a lot of it is actually based on actual newspaper reporting from the time, which I just put together. And I didn't make up, like some of the details, I didn't make up. Like the last reported sighting of him really is on an Aeroflot flight to Moscow. Okay, this is in a newspaper report. And after that, the Monkey Man vanishes from the annals of the newspapers, though not my book. But it is true that shortly after, there is a bear man reported in Assam. This is taken from the news, and I say, these are gifts to me from the universe. I am just going to take them and try to connect them together. These are like gifts from the universe. So you just take them. So the novel was finished in February 2020. And I was as taken aback as everybody else by COVID-19, because there is a flu here in the novel, but it was written before that, before COVID-19 broke out, and
I mean, one could think of conspiracy theories as the way in which people make sense of the absurdity of the world, and where news reporting and what you are seeing and observing around you don't come together. So sometimes you do have these news reports of absurd sightings, etc. But often you're reading, especially as you spoke of the present, what you read in the news, and the assessment experience of the world, the dissonance, and between the dissonance, it's a kind of storytelling maybe that functions, or imaginative work that functions to bridge that gap, and that is also that gap that is given a certain kind of, I think, fire or fieriness. There's a grit and fieriness to some of these absurd explosions in the novel. But I want to say that there's also very gentle, there are moments of of real gentleness or seeking gentleness and tenderness within the novel. And one of the moments is when the character Das is imagining Vimana, this aeroplane that's been built
Vedic
from
airplane.
Vedic
Right.
texts,
Yeah, right.
which would on surface be understood as tied to a kind of a very violent assertion of a Hindu imagination of the past. Here is transformed into a plane that is going to embody compassion. That is, it is, and allow for the telling of, and repeatedly sort of interspersed with this telling of a gentler history. And this is in the midst of that. This is in chapter 1947, where this veterinary student wants to fly this plane, and in order to pass his test, he has to ride a horse.
You're getting a sense of how crazy this novel is. I love it.
He has to ride a horse, and there's something very grounded about like being able to ride a horse, and so the aerial view, which we associate with catastrophic violence, is completely transformed into a flight of imagination where a certain kind of love and care, the word compassion repeatedly is associated with this suturing of this alternative kind of plane. Anyway, so I just wanted to know that there's a kind of juxtapositioning in there of this, and there's the angry passages, people who want to kill for hate and kill, and then there are these other passages where Vimana appears mystical, dreamlike.
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was writing it, I thought, okay, I think some of my friends, my leftist friends, are really going to be pissed with me with this Vimana, because it is, and I've written about it in nonfiction, right? It is completely a part of this sort of Hindu right fantasy about the past. So essentially what has happened is that now there are two ways to think about the Vimana. One is either, and I've written about this in nonfiction very critically, but I got interested in it because essentially, of course, the Vimana, the Ur text is not ancient. It's actually very modern. It's from the early 20th century. So it's clearly coming out of a very particular historical moment and predicament. And on the one hand, and I've written, again, as in the nonfiction, the manual, it's like, it's casteist, it's patriarchal, but there are also moments that are very, as a writer to me, the world building in it is like quite amazing. It's like, whoever thinks of bale of flowers in connection with an aircraft? And I am interested in the juxtaposition of things that don't belong. And I think that's really what the novel is about. And in that sense, the influence is really going back to surrealism. It's putting together things that are supposed to be kept separate. And this novel is against that kind of ideas of purity and in linearity. And I want to see what happens if you put together a spacecraft and a flower. Because why? I don't know. I think that's a reason. For me, it's a legitimate question. So the Vimana, there are two ways of thinking about it. You could write a Hindu right fantasy about it, and I'm sure there are some, which would just, which would show you these massive Ubermensch basically flying through time. Or you can do a critique, a kind of a left critique of it and say, which I have done, and say, this is completely concocted. But somehow here in this character's head, it became something different. And, it's always kept slippery. We don't know. What is it? Is it actually a fantasy of the right? Is this fantasy of his also a kind of fantasy, a kind of a weak fantasy of coming from bits of theosophy and, is this just a kind of a weak response to the actual violence of modernity? Or is it like, I think the book is asking, is it that the Vimana is like the clockwork dolls, the dolls that become alive in the, the automatons in the Sepoy mutinies, the 1859 section, or like the AI that writes poetry, this is long before ChatGPT, was made public, or the New Delhi Monkey Man, that are these possibilities, actually, because they are the angel. That's the other thing, right? Very much is a kind of very important figure in this novel. They clearly have to do with the human imagination because that's what the histories have constructed. But do they exceed and I suppose that's the thing, that can the Vimana be made to exceed the uses to which it is being put, and has always been made to create a fantasy of the past? Can it be made to exceed that? Can that be a worthy project for a novel that is, working against these ideas of linearity and purity and, triumphant visions of past or future or present?
Any questions from anyone in the audience? Yeah.
I read the book over the summer, and
I'm sorry?
I read the book over the summer.
Oh,
and,
okay.
Haven't revisited it very recently, but one thing that kind of has remained with me is how loud the book is in some ways, and the sense of place that is really chaotically evoked in each of the chapters. I think especially the Calcutta chapter, to me, from the visits to the psychologist / doctor and the secret society that we're not sure is a figment of this guy's imagination or not. There's an evocation of place that comes through not just the description of the characters, but sounds and textures and scents and things like that. And I would love to know, kind of from a craft point of view, how you came to evoking these places with such granularity over time.
Thank you. I mean, that is something of great interest to me as a writer, in narrative, in both nonfiction and fiction. And with the Calcutta section, I think there has always been this desire to create. I've never written a novel about Calcutta, but until this, but it's my first big city, and it was my first love. But it is also the city where my father was a veterinary student in 1947, and from the village in Sylhet where he was from. And of course, 1940s Calcutta is very well trodden area in Bengali writing, in even Bengali cinema. But I wanted to do my own thing about it. I wanted to do a kind of a Calcutta that's got this element of menace, but also mysticism, but also the trams. It wasn't hard because I think it wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. Delhi was similarly, there was a kind of a grudging love that I have developed for Delhi over the decades, having lived there. And so part of it was like I would go back and research. I remember doing that a lot for the Delhi and the Andaman sections. But even for the mountains, place is very important to me. And in some sense, it exceeds the nation. I am not very interested in national boundaries, but I am very interested in the landscape and the physical and the geological. And to me, they evoke a sense of belonging, of, which is much, much richer than any nation idea can be, because it's like weird because it just stops here, and that part of it comes from like the experience of being a refugee. My father family would say this, they would stop on the road and they would say, look, this is laughable, this is India and that is Bangladesh, it looks the same, it's just sloping down, and it's like we can't go there, they can't come here, we were there, they were here. But the landscape, and again, the first novel also talks about it, the landscape doesn't really care for this boundary making that you're doing. So yeah, so from a craft perspective, I do take lots of notes. I do when I go back. If I was to, I usually I let the story come first a little bit, and then if Das needs to walk along a certain part. So it's a lot of it is happening in North and Central Calcutta, which is where I went to college, and I walked all of it, and I was 18 years old. So it's completely in my body. I can still find my way around those alleyways, which makes me very proud. And I think a lot of that went in. And as you know, luckily, North and Central Calcutta hasn't changed very much through the decades, actually, And so I think a lot of that went into. There's some actual houses that I put in. There's a little act of revenge in one of the mansions that I put in because, because I can be very petty as a writer. It's an ex-girlfriend's house, so that is one of the more menacing mansions in the novel. No, I said, what the hell? I'm allowed to do it. It's a novel. I'm just making it all up. So yeah, but place is very important to me in terms of the texture of a narrative. Absolutely.
Maybe part 2 of the place, do you also write from Shillong in some sense?
Do I go back there and write?
No. In your mind is
in my head
where you're actually
you talk
standing.
about Calcutta as a young person, but come from Shillong.
Yeah, the first novel.
Shillong in your writing.
Yeah, it's here. It's here in BB's. It's very, very liminal here. There's more. She's displaced.
BB is from Shillong.
Yeah, right. She's displaced multiple times, but she lives in Delhi. But Shillong is a very big part. Assam is in here as well, because BB, that's the last reporting trip she does, is in Assam, and then she stops. When we begin the novel, we don't know why she has stopped being a journalist. But, I wrote about Shillong in an indirect way quite heavily in the first novel that I did. So here I didn't feel as compelled to touch upon it quite as directly. So it's much more peripheral. But obviously, it's always been for me, it's been very useful because it has allowed me to look at India from the side, from the periphery. And that is something I'm quite grateful for. And so in that sense, it's there even in this novel. Yeah, absolutely. And, the 2 main characters are, it's very strange. The 3 main characters I don't know how many main characters are there. But in the BB section, she's looking for her former boyfriend, also a journalist, who is a Meitei, and her roommate is a Cookie, and so there is a little piece of the Northeast even in Delhi, and there's a little attempt to hold on to this sense of the distant, the periphery, in a city that is extremely alienating at a certain level for these people, and you see that more with someone like Moe, who is Bibi's roommate, but she always wants to leave Delhi. She wants to get out of India. She hates it so much that she just wants to leave. She just wants to come to the West. She wants to immigrate to the West and remake herself anew. And Bibi says this is a stupid dream. But yeah, there is an incredible sense of loss for them of the Northeast, of the mountains, of the river valleys, and that is very much something that is there in BB as well. There is an incredible sense of loss. Yeah.
Yeah, admitting my utter ignorance, I've not read your book, and could you clarify since the titles are Lightning and the World? What do you mean, the light?
Well, if you read all the way to the end, you find out.
The last chapter is also called that.
The last part of the book is also called The Light. Yes. So,
Could you clarify that for me?
So, if you see the book, there are these 5 sections.
Okay.
And the first section is City of Broom, which is set in Delhi. The second section is Claustropolis, which is set in Bhopal in 1984. The third section is Paranoia, which is set in Calcutta in 1947. The fourth section is The Line of Faith, 1859, which is set in the Himalayas. And the fifth section is The Light at the End of the World. So it's a journey. It's a journey, but it's also about feeling trapped in the world and a sense that it's ending. There is a
So
kind.
it's not a mental process, not an epiphany, but it's a personal journey.
It's more ambiguous than that, I think. But it's up to you. This is where it's really up to the reader. This is where, and different readers have different takes on it, and that is something that I greatly believe in, because I think every reader makes their own novel, and people read this book, and the other books, yeah, people read them very differently. So, and I teach creative writing. Like we talk about the ending of a Bologna novel, and my students don't agree with the ending, the interpretation that I have of the ending at all, which is totally okay, because so I think for me it's meant to be ambiguous and meant to have double meaning. One of the meanings has to do with what happens at the end of the novel when you get to it, but it also is meant to echo through the book.
Thank you.
It's also a play on a Jules Verne novel called The Lighthouse at the End of the World.
Okay.
Yeah. The novel is very interested in these edges, like archipelagos, mountains. It's very, very interested in, that's the part where I think the whole question of climate collapse comes in. It's very interested in mountains, waters, islands, archipelagos, and when it takes place in the Andaman Islands, that's where the continental shelf ends. Actually, it's not just India as a nation ends. That particular shelf ends, and there's something called the Sunda Trench, which is one of the deepest points of the ocean, and you have a completely different tectonic plate. So the novel is very interested in these fault lines which exceed anything that we have made. And it's very, very, in that sense, it's quite one of its mystical. It's very interested in these questions. That's also what it means by the end of the world. End of the world can mean our world going up in flames, and that's certainly one meaning. But it can also mean like this is the point where the trench ends and there is an abyss, and we haven't been able to go all the way down into the we haven't been able to explore the ocean beyond a certain depth. So it's very interested in that also, this meaning of what is the world, and what is human, what is the human world, and what is the non-human world.
Yeah.
Ria, did you have a
Yes.
question? Yeah.
Well, you've spoken a bit about how your creative practice as a novelist, you contrast that with your straightforward practice as a journalist. I wonder if writing characters who are journalists like BB has changed your own kind of approach to journalism. Because BB in the novel is kind of a crazy journalist. She
Quits, right?
yeah, I mean, there's like a desperation and she goes to all lengths, basically, as a journalist. Yeah, kind of wondering what it means for you as someone who also does journalism to write a character of that same profession.
Yeah, I probably won't do it again for a while. I think I was very interested in her in a kind of traditionally male space, and having a kind of sensitivity that is not usually welcome in institutionalized fields. And journalism can be very macho, especially in the U.S. actually. But I was interested. She's an outsider in many ways, certainly as a woman, but also as somebody from like the Shillong, from outside the periphery. But she has a kind of sensitivity, I think, which is, I was interested in exploring that, which is not, like I said, which I don't think is welcomed in institutionalized spaces. They don't have a way of really, funneling that. So that was of interest to me. And of course I was giving her little bits of my own frustrations and experiences. I am very attracted to people who are haunted by a sense of failure, and she certainly is. And I think my editor, Mark, for the American editor, he has a really good comment to make about Bibi in one of his notes. Because he saw her completely differently from one aspect of her. And when he first said it, as soon as he said it, though, I knew it was right. That he was right. So you create characters. Characters are really complex. And for me, she took a while to come. But once she did, she was very alive and very complex. But yeah, she's very haunted by this sense of failure. That is very interesting. That is something that I'm very interested in, have always been. She has what people would call an imposter syndrome out here. She has a very strong sense of that. But I found that an interesting place to go. But the best thing I can tell is that when I gave her her last assignment, which is the one she does, and it kind of falls apart, you find out much later in the book, when the detention center. And the thing is, the uncanny thing about it is that when I thought about it, and I had this. These things come in strange ways. Okay, so I had this vision of, I don't mean to sound like, but I had this image. Image sounds more.
No, vision sounds good.
So I said, okay, what is the last story she does? And I thought, okay, I had this very clear image that she is walking across these two precarious bamboo trunks that's crossing a large stretch of green water, which is very typical in the Northeast and possibly is very typical in other places too. But certainly in Assam, it's very common because it floods so frequently. And you put up these makeshift pathways, so like in like the post office, you can't go to the post office anymore because the entire pathway has been flooded. But people have to get to the post office, so you put two little bamboo trunks and you have to be this gymnast. And I always think I'm going to fall off this and everybody's going to laugh off me. But so at first I thought, okay, that's what she's doing. She's going to the post office. And then I thought, no, she's not going to the post office. She's going somewhere else. And then I had this piece that I had written in. It was on Manipur. It's coming out next year in this collection that is coming out. But it was on this. I had gone to find a refugee camp, a Burmese refugee camp in Manipur, which was kind of hidden. Nobody knew about it, but it had been there for 20 years, and I found it. But it was inside a military base, which is what, so you had to go inside the military base and then you had to go to the back of the military base. But we did get there, I write about it, but in order to get to this refugee camp, which was like a little village, you had to cross this river. And in order to, not a river, a stream, I'm exaggerating, it's not a river, a stream. But of course they put these two little bamboo trunks on it. And I said, I am absolutely going to fall off this into the stream. And but I didn't. So then I thought, okay, she's going to a Burmese refugee camp. Because, it's very simple. I'll give her my story. That's what you do for characters. And then that didn't seem right either. And then, it took like 3, 4, 5 tries, because she dreams of this as well. And then it became very clear to me that she's visiting a detention center in Assam. And I had not been to a detention center in Assam. They didn't even exist at the time. But it came to me literally, that phrase, she's visiting a detention center in Assam. And so I wrote it, and I finished the novel. And then 1 year later, I got an assignment to go to Assam to write about a detention center. And so I was sitting in my hotel room in Guwahati, and I was texting my friend saying, this is so weird. I am doing the same trip she did in the book all those years ago. And actually make her cross the river at a certain point, at a certain bridge, which doesn't exist, or didn't exist. And I'm chatting with the driver. He says, they're building a new bridge out there. So, but yeah, I have the whole journey of her coming down from Shillong through the highways of the Northeast and ending towards the riverine plains of Assam. And then, I had finished the book, and 2 years later, I was suddenly doing this assignment, and I was like, but my detention camp was this is journalism. It was very, clearly, hers is a very strange detention center. It exceeds whatever the, the government, the states, it exceeds those things, as which is true of the novel again. Yeah, but it took like a lot of tries to get that right, but I enjoyed it eventually.
So we have about 10 more minutes, I think. So any other questions that people have?
Yeah. Can I say something after maybe, actually something existential. Now I'm trained as an evolution biologist. You always talk about the weirdness in the world, right? And the world that has no meaning, no purpose, is random until human come into existence. Until human come into existence. So we come to define what the world is. And so now after all the books, all the philosophy, all the talks, right? And we still haven't figured out what you talk about the weirdness. Now we have artificial intelligence, and they have emergent properties that come beyond our capacity, our imagination, right? And our mental process. You think, and eventually that weirdness will be solved.
I'm more interested in saying, should it be solved? I don't think everything has to have a solution. And at least in this novel. I mean, I think this novel very clearly at a certain point says that this is, I think there's a part where, no, I mean the novel is very clear. It would say no. I don't know what I would say, but in this novel, I think I have to read this part, I think. I think it's towards the end, so, but, yeah. So, yeah, I'll just read it. It's from the end. The truth is sometimes everywhere, she thinks as she walks, even if it turns out to be as strange as fiction. It is in the dreams that unlock themselves, in the walks that you take, and in the eyes that follow you in tailoring shops and along subway corridors. It is in the stories you choose to read, the places you are drawn to, Tunnel of Jinns, Museum of Dolls, Island of Savages. Stories of the fantastic that offer themselves to you on the web, reminding you that you are not just the hunted or the discounted, but that you too have been touched by the transcendent, have been found by lines of poems that write themselves beneath chemical-tinged screens. Cybernetics. She has looked up the word. It means the system of communications in both machines and living things, and it originates from the Greek word kubernetes, meaning steersman or boatman. Everywhere, those who have doubt in their souls about the lies their world is mired in, who mourn its long ongoing collapse under the tutelage of a few, they all receive intimations from the kubernetes. And then I'm just going to Sometimes this takes the shape of passing strangers who have something of the animal in them, and sometimes the form of seemingly misdirected messages that show up in the spam folder. There are calls from unknown numbers late in the night that inexplicably have nothing to sell, no threats and abuses to impart, that speak in languages one does not even understand. There are suggestive shapes in clouds and dust storms, in the pattern of rain streaking down a window pane, and on the mineral-rich bird droppings splattered on the ground. And of course, the messages are most frequent, most insistent in that last free realm of ours, our dreams, asking us to listen to our deepest selves, to whatever in us that most yearns to be liberated. So I think I'm more interested in freedom than in solutions. So at least in this book, this character, and in mystery, because one of the fundamental aspects of freedom is to be in the presence of that which exceeds understanding, I think. And
I'm not looking for a solution either, but I'm looking for explanation. Yeah, and I think eventually, everything, I agree with everything you said over here. So it was wonderful. And that shows the limitation of the human capacity. It's something beyond. I think the math is arbitrary universe, nothing else is. So eventually, I think artificial intelligence is able to put all those things into equations, explain.
maybe.
Wow.
So I haven't read the novel, but I'm reminded in the genre and also like your invocation of a lot of like your commentary on the form of the Indian novel of Gitanjali Shree's Tomb of Sand, Ved Samadhi, because the way that you play with time, it's I think I'm drawing a lot of similarities with that, and it's clear in Shree's novel that she's inserting herself in this kind of pantheon of like independence writers and before independence like Premchand and Manto and so. But when you were talking about your kind of like your canonical inspirations, it seemed more transnational, right? It's not just the Indian literature, but it's also literatures of the global South. So I can you speak a little bit to more of like how the canon influences like how you write the novel intentionally, not just like after the fact, who you've seen the novel to be in conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think I grew up in Shillong, right? So for me, and not only did I grow up in Shillong, but my father's family is from Sylhet in Bangladesh, and which is a different language from Bengali. So in Bengali culture is this big thing, but it's like I've always been these sort of moving between these spaces, and then Shillong itself, the Northeast itself, Meghalaya itself had its own many languages, Khasi, Garo, Jaintia, and then there's Hindi, and even India was this. It was an imposition, an idea. I mean, I don't think so. That's what I mean. I think this is something that I took on very early on. It was not a thing we quite believed in. Partly because it was very far away, partly because it was evident only in the bureaucracy and the military. So these are the only ways in which one saw India. And I think that is the experience of many people, certainly in the Northeast. So India was a very distant idea. It was a distant idea in the same way Europe was a distant idea or America was a distant idea. A little less distant, but the whole flag raising. I mean, the Northeast makes it very clear that you are in a frontier military zone. I mean, one of the things I, as a child, loved most is that every single state capital in India, there is a battle tank in front of the state library. And there was one in front of the State Central Library in Shillong, and I played inside that battle tank as a child. It was an actual tank, and this was great. And but when you grow up later, you learn that these are all tanks captured from the Pakistani army in 1965. So they're basically war trophies. So you cannot live in a place, I mean, you can live in a place like this and be completely blind. I know many people, but it wasn't possible for me. So, I mean, for me, both Bengali high literature, I mean, forget about the Hindi, the Hindi was even more distant, but even Bengali high literature, Tagore, was very alien to me. And it took me a lot of effort to come to Tagore, and I had to sidestep the whole, I still detest Tagore songs. I do, but that's a whole person. I detest Tagore songs, because I was made to sing them as a child. But I discovered Tagore as a writer on my own in university. I discovered him as a fiction writer and essayist, and then I realized I think he's an amazing fiction writer. Actually, he's an amazing novelist. But I had to make my own journey. But so I didn't really grow up with that. I grew up reading a lot of British fiction, and I grew up reading people like R.K. Narayan, and Salman Rushdie, and but I think one of my great sources was Bengali children's literature. And Bengali children's literature, I don't know what it's like now, but was actually truly internationalist. There was a lot of translation from across the world. I read my first Holocaust novel in Bangla, in a children's book. I mean, it's a translation from a German. It's a translation of a German novel. I read my first story of a first Palestinian novella, also in Bengali translation. So you just read extremely widely, and I think Bengali children's literature was also extremely open to genres like science fiction and detective fiction. And that's there in Satyajit Ray, because and Satyajit Ray that's why he's a kind of complicated figure. He's both a figure of high culture, but he also wrote like very popular children's books. So I have my answer is very non-literate, I feel, but I feel like that was a huge influence. And for a long time, I used to feel embarrassed about it, and then I stopped being embarrassed about it. I said, okay, these are my influences, and I think that really cultivated my taste for like the kind of reading that I have done. And I didn't want to confine myself to Indian or even South Asian writing. Partly, as I said, it seemed to be very stuck within realism, which I was really wanted to break from. But that's where I found someone like Bolaño very liberating, because he's also third worldist, but he's from a very different kind of third world, and he's also kind of eclectic in liking science fiction. Playing, on the one hand, yes, he's influenced by Borges, but on the other hand, he's influenced. But I think growing up in the Northeast, I didn't feel I had to be Indian or that I could be Indian. And, at first you want to be. And then you realize, I think as Baldwin said, that by the time you can, it's like too late and you don't want to become part of what you wanted to. He has this whole thing about in France being said, you are civilized, you are évolué. Why do you identify with the Algerians? And, Baldwin says, all my life I had grown up wanting to be called civilized, and now that it came to me, I realized I wanted no part of it. And for me, so India, the canonical, has never been a huge influence. Of course, I'm aware of the Great Partition, Bisham Sani, Tamas, I think is one of the great sort of partition novels. In Bengali literature, again, there are, but I like to cultivate my marginal outsider space, and in that sense, I'm also quite influenced by a certain style of American writing. Afrofuturism, I don't see why not. Why do I have to only be influenced by my nationality? So I'm actually quite influenced by Afrofuturism. I think is again a kind of writing where I have found them grappling with similar questions, similar to mine. So for me, that has been a very, very productive place to go and read and think.
Thank you.
Oh, we have time?
I think, that's a wonderful note on which to end. We have chai and samosas outside, and we can keep asking Siddharth questions there as well.
Thank you
all for coming. Yeah.
Thank you.